The places and spaces where we live are riddled with the past. Buildings, roads, signs, trees, any number of things in our built and natural environments speak to our histories. But do we listen enough? And do we know how to hear what they have to tell us? Today on Take on the South, we delve into the fascinating world of historic preservation to discover what preservation is, how it works, what gets to be preserved and what doesn't, and to think about the enduring value of preserving the past. To help us ponder these questions and more, I'm delighted to have on the program Robin Waits, the Executive Director of Historic Columbia in Columbia, South Carolina. Robin Waits assumed her position in 2004, following 2 years at Historic Columbia and 6 at the State Museum. Her tenure has been an astounding success. This is also a poignant interview because after 20 years at the helm of Historic Columbia, Robin will be stepping down as Executive Director in June of this year. This is an occasion to talk not only about historic preservation in South Carolina, but to reflect on those 20 years of leadership. Robin, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Mark. I'm happy to be here.
Okay, we have a lot to talk about, but before we get into the specifics of Historic Columbia and preservation generally, can you just tell us where you're from and where you grew up and how did you end up in this field?
Sure, yeah. I'm from here. I was born in Columbia, South Carolina, and was here until I went off to college. As a senior in high school, was committed to not living in South Carolina beyond that point.
I understand. Which high school did you go to?
I went to AC Flora High School.
Okay,
yeah.
right.
I left here to attend Middlebury College, which is in Vermont.
Oh, yes.
Which was a great experience. But I have a lot of family here.
Right.
And ultimately, my sister started having kids. And a couple of years after I graduated from college, ended up coming back to the university for graduate school.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, as soon as there's a little nephew calling you rah-rah, it's pretty much over.
Right. It changes.
It's pretty much,
it?
it does. It changes
Middlebury
everything.
becomes a distant
That's
memory
right,
at that point.
That's right.
So do those cold winters, I'm sure.
Exactly,
Right?
Exactly.
Middlebury's a great school, though, isn't
Yeah.
it? I mean, it's known for lots of things, but it has a very strong language program.
Yeah, I was
right?
actually a Russian major
Yes.
at Middlebury. Russian and art history. So
Russian and
it all comes back to
you know,
to that
this
piece.
place has a way of pulling people back.
It does.
I
It
get
does.
it.
It
I get
does.
it. And then when you came back, you started to do what?
Yeah, I was in graduate school for art history, and I was working at a place called Havens Frame Makers. I was hanging shows for them and doing just looking at cool art.
Betsy Haven, yeah.
Betsy Havens, yes, and had an opportunity to work at the South Carolina State Museum because of my experience as a preparator, interestingly. And so ended up landing a job at the State Museum in the art department, and ultimately moved into a curatorial position there based on that. But my time in Columbia as a young person was really influenced by, I have a very artistic family. So my grandfather, Ed Yajin, was actually the first dean of the art department at USC.
Okay.
He came here from New York in 1947, and in his early work in Columbia, painted areas that are no longer standing, and specifically the Ward 1 neighborhood, which Bobby Donaldson has done a lot of work, and then other historians in Columbia and beyond have done. And so I had this really interesting sort of work all around my house as a kid that were images of Columbia and a very interesting kind of past of Columbia that others didn't necessarily think were interesting to paint, but my
Sure.
grandfather found really, he was taught by John Sloan, who was a New York artist who liked kind of the gritty part of,
Gotcha.
of New York, and my grandfather kind of took that on and brought it here. So.
Yeah. Well, thank God he did. Right?
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's interesting to think back about how that has informed my interest in preservation from a perspective that I think a lot of folks who get into preservation don't necessarily think of the type of buildings or places of being important to preserve in the same way that I do.
Yeah, right, which leads to the kind of big question, what is preservation exactly? I mean, I think you're right that if you ask the average person on the street, they say, well, it's, the antebellum, plantation, is that... And of course, that's part of the story, but we're talking about a whole community here, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
it's at every level.
Yeah.
So that's how you see
For
Historic
sure.
Columbia functioning, right?
Yeah, and I think when I came to Historic Columbia in 2002, the focus of the organization really was on the houses that we managed, and two of those are antebellum sites that were associated with plantation owners or were owned by enslavers, and are very grand, kind of typical Southern urban structures that you might think of from that period, and collections within those that help to tell those stories.
Yeah.
In addition to that, Historic Columbia manages the Woodrow Wilson, what was then the Woodrow Wilson family home, and then two sites that are associated with African American community, the Man Simon site, and in 2006 took over stewardship of the Majeska Simpkins home.
Right.
But I think that the organization was really focused on those houses and those stories. And I saw this as an opportunity to certainly continue to develop dynamic interpretation at those sites that might not have been told before. Yeah. So looking at all of the individuals who lived and worked there, as well as expanding the scope of the stories that we tell. So, we started with, we had a great new strategic plan in 2006 that enabled us to look at storytelling in a different way. So moving into neighborhoods, looking at very, very, I think, different kind of populations than we had been looking at when we were just dealing with our houses. Because while those houses are important, they don't tell the story of everybody who lives and works in Columbia and Richland County, right? And the second piece of that 2006 strategic plan was to develop a more robust preservation advocacy arm. And so those two things kind of coupled, right, that you've got this really interesting opportunity to look at different communities surrounding the city center, but also just become more active in promoting the preservation of those places and stories.
And making the stories accessible, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. How long has Historic Columbia been around?
Yeah, 1961.
Was it
It was
really?
founded, yeah.
Oh,
and a couple of years later was 1964 was when the National Preservation Act was instituted. So you had this really kind of boon of that's when the National Register was established. So buildings began to be added to that, districts began to be added to that, but they really were focused on, in the South particularly, antebellum structures.
Sure. Can you give us some sense of the scale of Historic Columbia? I mean, you manage lots of properties, but how many do you have? How many staff?
Yeah.
Give us a sense of budget. I mean,
Sure.
people tend to think, historic preservation is small and kind of off in the corner, but I think it's much bigger than that, isn't it?
Yeah, and again, when I started 22 years ago, we were about a $300,000 budget. We had 6 full-time staff, and we had 6 buildings to manage. Today, we have 22 full-time staff, about the same number of part-time, and our budget this year is $2.5 million. So it has grown over the last 20 years pretty significantly.
Yeah.
And it takes that to manage old places, but it also takes that to be an organization that's really embedded in community, which I think is what we've been able to do.
Actually, so that leads me to this question of challenges. I mean, you've got very old buildings here, right? And it's not just, you can't just slap a, new coat of paint on, can you?
Right.
You have to be very careful, very curatorial about it.
Absolutely.
Can you take us through some of the challenges that you face at Historic Columbia in what is quite an unforgiving environment? I mean, physically, this is hot, it's humid. Rot should be a problem, I'm guessing.
Yeah, for sure.
Take us through what the challenges are.
Yeah, I'll give you an example of a property that the Woodrow Wilson family home is a great example of this. So in 2005, we actually had to close that building. So it's a wood frame structure, was built in 1869. It was built on a brick base, but it was a balloon frame construction, essentially, which means it kind of ebbs and flows, like the building breathes, literally.
Yeah.
So in 2005, we had to close it because it was in such bad disrepair. We had staff who were giving tours, and they had fleas on their pants because there were like creatures living under that.
Really?
I mean, it was just it was a mess.
Goodness.
So we went through this historic structures report, which is something that you do when you're investigating, assessing the issues with historic buildings. And we found that the entire sill of the building was rotted.
Oh.
You could take a screwdriver and just press it through, and the big piece of wood that's holding the building up was totally compromised.
Oh.
And so that was the first full-scale rehabilitation that I had been a part of.
Mm-hmm.
What's different about doing that versus what was done in the 1960s, let's say, to the Robert Mills House, is in the 2000s, we were really interested in preserving as much historic integrity as we could. So we pulled the claps off the building and saved those, pulled the paint off those, reinstalled those. We were able to go up at the Wilson House into the roof and determine what kind of roofing material was on it by the nail patterns in the roof. So we knew it was a wood shingled roof based on that. So we were able to kind of reconstruct this building. We went inside, we did paint analysis on the inside and the outside. So prior to the rehabilitation, it was just a gray building with white accents. Mm-hmm. And now it's this beautiful Victorian era building that has a really diverse set of paint colors on it, so it really pops when you go in. But there's tools now that are available to determine when it was built, what was used exactly, and then we could go back and implement that. But it's always, you're always kind of running behind. Right?
Yeah.
When you install, for example, a contemporary HVAC system in an 1860s building,
Right.
it's not going to necessarily respond in the way that you might anticipate that it would have in the 1860s. So trying to introduce new systems into old buildings is always a challenge.
So,
as well.
you presumably have to rely on very specialized, skilled
Absolutely.
labor, right? You can't, it's not your average bloke down the road that can do this, right?
And that's part of actually, Mark, the work that we have done is for that project, and it took years to complete. For that project, we brought in architects from Kentucky. We brought contractors in from Charleston. And we had specialists who were coming in from all over the country. One of the goals that we had at that time was to work to build a preservation program in Columbia and in South Carolina that would be more robust so that people wouldn't have to go outside of the state or even outside of Columbia to get preservation experts to come to the table. And so when you're able to kind of build that capacity locally, it makes it more affordable to do the work, but people also take a different sense of pride, I think, in that work if they're able to work with a hood construction as opposed to somebody out at Charleston.
I should imagine that pride is really important for the overall kind of atmospherics of it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So let me probe a little bit on this because I'm really interested in this question of authenticity, right? So what I'm hearing from you is that Historic Columbia got better over time at being more authentic because you had more tools, more analysis. So the colors are true to 1869 or whatever it was. What are the limits to authenticity, right?
Sure.
I mean, these sites, some of these sites are quite contested, right? You have enslaved people,
Absolutely.
you have plantation owners. What's the philosophy underwriting something like Historic Columbia and the idea of authenticity and preservation?
Yeah. So I think for us, and if we stay at that site in particular, the taking it back to a certain period was important to us because we wanted to tell a story from a certain perspective, and that was that period. It was the 1860s, the Reconstruction. So today it is the Museum of Reconstruction at the Woodrow Wilson Family Home. While a house museum or organization like ours might, from an authenticity perspective, then repopulate it with furnishings that would have been used by the family that lived there.
Right.
At the Wilson site, we had 11 artifacts that were connected to the family. And so it was not the right thing to do to repopulate that as the Woodrow Wilson Family Home. We knew very little about his time here, and we didn't want to try to recreate something that wasn't authentic, right? And so that was our first sort of foray into creating a museum in a historic house. That the envelope is really important to us, but in terms of people's experience at the site, we think that can be informed in more dynamic ways if it is a different kind of storytelling, if there are exhibits in it, if you use artifacts in different ways. So we've kind of done away with this idea of you having to feel like as you walk into the house, you're walking back into the 1860s,
Right.
so much as you're learning about what that period was like. And there's value to that, to people who still do that sort of traditional historic house museum. I mean, we don't find that is as impactful for our visitors, and it doesn't enable us to tell the kind of stories that we want to tell at those places.
So how would you weigh that the more traditional approach of sort of walking through the door and then kind of in 1869 versus this envelope approach of this is interpretive, highly contextual? Where's the field moving?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a combination of that still is going on, and maybe the work that we've done at the Hampton Preston site is more kind of along those lines. So when we did a new interpretation at HP, which was a site that was built in 1818, is really known for its association with Wade Hampton I and his family. That was the story that Historic Columbia was telling at the site when I arrived.
Yeah.
We found that we have a lot of information about the enslaved individuals who lived there and who worked there, as well as its time during Reconstruction when the governor lived there. It was then a college for women. It was then a tourist home. So there's all sorts of stories that you can tell at that site. And so I think that having the opportunity to just be really creative in those spaces, that it gives people access. It helps a different group of individuals feel like they belong in that space than just the people who might have connected with Wade Hampton I and his family who was there. So, I think that right now in the field there certainly are people who are looking at ways to be more inclusive, that certainly is a strain, that there are folks who are doing that using digital tools to do that or audio tools to do that, and that's something that we're working on right now at the Robert Mills House, just for kind of being creative and creating an experience that does feel like an envelope but doesn't kind of put you back in time in a way that is uncomfortable or dangerous in some ways even, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's more gestural, right? It's the atmospherics of it, and it's it functions as a metaphor. It's like this, but this is not the moment or the place.
Exactly.
So we've gone through the challenges, or some of them at least. This must be inherently a rewarding job. For you, can you just tell us, the highlight, or a couple of the highlights? These are the things you're really proud of.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to harp on the Museum of Reconstruction,
right.
but that probably
Harp
is,
away,
I think, for
Yeah.
me, really an important turning point for the organization, because we were willing to address the Reconstruction era, which people had not been willing to talk about prior to that. And so it was really it was a transition point, I think, for the organization. We reopened it in 2012, and we're really anxious about the reception that it would receive. Because people were talking about Reconstruction in a very different way at that time. And we were trying to debunk the myths of that era. It turned out that people were really interested and wanted to have those perspectives. And so that, I think, gave us the courage to do that at other sites. I think that the other piece for me is in 2008, we started a project called Connecting Communities Through History. And that was a part of going out into community and collecting, again, very different stories. And it started geographically. We were looking at neighborhoods and then turned to thematic areas. So we have explored the African American community, the Jewish community, the LGBTQ community. So I think in general, like using that tool to expand access to stories. But the way that we did that was to not go in and research and then tell you what your story is. We actually went in and asked people to share their stories, to share their materials, to tell us the stories that they knew, and then we created a platform for those to be accessible, right? So that it kind of flips on its head your traditional curatorial, I'm the historian, I know more than you do about your past, and so I'm going to tell you that, to actually enabling people to be a part of that story. which then grew the base of support for the organization. Because again, if you see yourself represented in a place, then you're much more likely to engage with that organization. And that just over the course of my time has been what I've been interested in doing, and I think it's changed the face of the organization. It's changed the way that, again, we're just embedded in the community as opposed to being a place that people come to.
Yeah. Can you give us a sense of metrics, popularity? How many visitors do you get?
Yeah. Pre-pandemic, really, I think we were at our height at around 45,000 visitors annually, and that includes public programs. It includes tours of the houses. Cool. We're still in a bit of recovery. I think we had right around 30 in the last
fiscal
year.
I mean, everybody's in recovery
mode.
But that's really impressive.
Yeah.
Very good. So, in your opinion, you've done an enormous lot. You've grown it with your fabulous staff, some of whom I know, some of whom I'm going to meet soon. What does Historic Columbia look like 20 years from now? If you had your druthers.
Yeah. I think one of the areas that there's a great potential for growth is with the preservation advocacy side of things. So again, that looks like if there's a building that's being threatened with demolition on Main Street, or the Palmetto Compress Warehouse is a great example of a building that was threatened with demolition, that we came to the table and brought folks together to save that space. Yeah. I think you're looking at the preservation of place in different ways. I would love to see an expansion of National Register districts so that a neighborhood like Greenview, which is a historically black neighborhood established in the 1940s, could be on the National Register, could take advantage of tax credits that are available for that could be become a space where history is really more elevated. It's very important to that community now, but others don't really recognize that. So I think it's expanding sort of the access to the tools that make preservation financially viable throughout the community.
Yeah.
I think that the organization itself, I feel really good about where we are with our house museums, with our grounds. We've got one house that we haven't done a interpretation of, and that's Robert Mills, as you know. So I think it just is an expansion from the preservation side of building a Columbia that really understands the value of preservation and cares about it, and that the stories are more dynamic and continuing to be elevated.
That makes perfect sense to me. I'm kind of curious how you see the role of virtual visits to historic homes. We've been hearing about it for years. It's becoming something of a reality. What's your kind of gut check on all of that?
Yeah, we used to be really afraid of that. Like if you put everything online, people are not going to come, and that's just not the case. Right. People who want to come and see a house museum are going to come regardless. So, I think it provides greater access. We are working right now with Bloomberg Connects to do a garden tour that will be virtual, that will also be an audio tour if people come to the sites that they can take advantage of it. So I think there are lots of ways to give people the resources that they need or want. From a research perspective, we just put all our collections online. We were, again, 10 years ago, we were really afraid to do that.
Right.
Because nobody would come.
Right.
But I think there's so many ways that we can make more of our tools accessible to others. I say put it all out there.
Because it grows, right?
Absolutely.
That's the point.
Absolutely.
So. And it presents certain challenges when you do it virtually, but nonetheless is a way to stimulate even further and greater interest. That strikes me as being absolutely right. Is there a group, or is there a site or something that you think needs greater attention that hasn't received it?
Both. So I would say there's actually a building on Millwood. It's called the Christine Apartments.
Yeah, I know that. Yes.
Yeah. If there's one building that I think in my career that I feel like we have missed, and not that we haven't tried, but That's a great mid-century modern structure right at the edge of the Melrose Heights neighborhood. It's part of the Millwood corridor. It's been a site of certainly residential use, but lots of creative folks have been housed there. It's a beautiful building.
It is.
It's in just terrible disrepair right now,
Yeah.
and would be a great tax credit project. It's a great. It would be cool in terms of reinvigorating life on Millwood. There's not a lot going on there, but it would add a different dimension to that. So it is ripe for the taking.
Yeah.
I think there's some issues with ownership right now that are causing problems that are not helping that move forward. But places like that are abandoned essentially and have the opportunity to really impact neighborhood growth, commercial growth. It's right at the edge of those things. I would love to see that happen.
It's funny, I just drove past it the other day and I thought, I haven't seen any sign of life in there for years.
Yeah.
It's just standing and it's such a shame.
Yeah.
Especially since Millwood is kind of undergoing a bit of a rejuvenation.
Absolutely.
You've got, your Starbucks, but other local businesses there. Well, I did notice the florist had closed down, which is very sad.
Yeah.
But anyway, yes. Right, go on. So
They come
Christine
and go.
Building,
Yeah.
fabulous idea.
I mean, I just what I referenced earlier, I think a neighborhood like the Greenview neighborhood, which is a little bit later. And we're moving, we're moving into the 1940s and 50s and 60s now in terms of what's historically important.
Right.
And it's hard for people who were born when those buildings were built or lived in them to actually see value in those. I think mid-century modern is just becoming more popular in the last 10 years. But I think the Greenview neighborhood would be another area that there's a lot of pride there. And this is, again, a historically black neighborhood that was established after World War II.
Yep.
But to get that community to collect their stories, do some oral histories there, to help establish a district that creates access to tools would be another great area to work in.
So what is Robin Waite going to do when she steps down? Any plans or ambitions? Take things easy for a bit?
Yeah, I'm going to take things easy for a little bit. I've got some travel planned. My wife retired about 6 years ago and has been ready for me to not work as hard as I do.
Right,
It doesn't mean that I will not find something new to kind of sink my teeth into, but I'm going to take a little bit of a break.
Robin Waits, thank you for being on Take on the South, but most importantly, thank you for taking care of Columbia.